Welcome to the Development Context of Sovereign Credit Ratings, a podcast by UNDP and Africa Catalyst, where we explore the intersection of finance policy and development across Africa. My name is Maggie Motesi, and I'm your host. Now, recent shocks to the multilateral systems have the potential to decrease the fiscal space of African countries. These include budget cuts by major donor countries and agencies, the diversion of aid from development to humanitarian activities, as well as increased trade barriers and protectionism in major world economies. Given all these factors, more African countries have turned to global capital markets to finance their development. But a key gateway to foreign financing is a sovereign credit rating from one of the big three agencies. They not only influence the cost of borrowing, but also investor sentiment, debt sustainability, and the broader perception of a country's macroeconomic management. In today's episode, we'll explore the policy and institutional reforms needed to make credit ratings fairer and more accurate, while advocating equity and transparency in multilateral and financial institutions so that the global financial architecture truly reflects the diverse realities and needs of all countries. Joining us today is David McNair, the Executive Director at the One Campaign. He's also a policy advocate, campaigner, and the author of Why Europe Needs Africa. David, thanks for joining us on the show, and it's really good to have you.
Thanks for having me, Maggie.
One of the things we've done in the past few episodes is hosting former rating analysts, but also we've had dialogues where we've had credit rating agencies like the bosses or the analysts that are doing the work now on the table. We've come a long way, and this is really good to see that credit rating agencies are actually engaging with African countries right now. Do you think that that's good enough for a start?
I think it's a good start, and it's good that this issue is now higher on the agenda. In a sense, if you look at the macro picture that you've just described, the access to external finance in terms of either traditional aid financing or even the financing that China provided, over the past decade, it's really drying up in a lot of cases. And because of the volatility in the financial system, private investors are becoming more cautious. And, there's so much promise in the kind of rhetoric around private capital, stepping into the gap, kind of stepping into a massive market with massive potential. But for that to become a reality, we need to be addressing the kind of structural barriers that are in some sense a restriction to that private capital flowing. And some of that is, practical stuff like having bankable projects and having, countries that have kind of clear sets of regulation, and that there are steps to improve governance and reduce the substantive risk. The other thing is, the way in which perceptions and the absence of data, which then leads to perceptions becoming more influential. There's a lot that we can do there on the policy front that would help level the playing field. And in this, era of disruption where access to capital is so scarce, making that capital more affordable will be so important.
Yeah. From hearing you speak, looks like a big question here is governance. David, could you speak to us more about it?
Well, I think there are a few different dimensions when you're thinking about, evaluating the risk both of a country in borrowing and of private investors within that country. There's, boiling it down to the most simple terms, it's, will the investor make a return and what's the risk of them not getting their money back? And I think what we need to do is to kind of really dig into the numbers and have more analysis, more transparency around what the actual risks are. Because, a lot of the analysis that we have seen from UNDP and others shows that actually the perceived risk is much higher than the actual risk that investors face. And if you have that data with clear analytics disclosed in the right formats at the right frequency, then it creates an environment where those kinds of perceptions of higher risk aren't allowed to flourish because you've got real data and analysis.
It's a question of perception. So we need more accurate data to actually break that, but there is no guarantee that actually that would also change. From where you see it from a development perspective, I would really like for you to break it for our audience that, when we speak about credit ratings, it's not just the numbers we're talking about, but it's just the hospitals that are not equipped with the infrastructure that is broken. It's just relating back to the ordinary persons that we were saving.
The first step is to look at the purpose of debt. And in a sense, debt buys you time. If you think about something that you can't afford now, but you invest in the future on the basis that, if you make that investment, you can pay the debt back and make more money. And we see that in our personal lives with credit cards and with mortgages and so on. And if you look at the African continent as a whole, in the 10 years, running up to 2023, which is when we have the latest data, Africa's debt more than doubled. And that in part was because, the interest rates, internationally were close to zero. Governments were encouraged to borrow from Eurobond markets. With massive infrastructure needs and growing populations, it made sense. But now that low interest rate environment no longer exists, and the cost of that debt is really going up. And in a sense, Kenya is a really good example of this, where a couple of years ago, I'm sure you remember this, the government chose not to pay civil servants so that it could make a Eurobond payment. And while that is quite technical, when you think about it, it's basically civil servants, teachers, hospital workers, nurses are essentially working for free so that Wall Street bankers can get paid. And the reason why that happened, I know there's a lot of controversy around the role that the government played in the IMF and so on. But ultimately, if Kenya was to default on that debt, its risk rating would go up and future debt would cost even more. So you're in this kind of impossible position of, do you fund the essentials or do you keep paying the debt service so that, in future you can borrow more, in future you can invest more? And that tension is really, really difficult. But part of it is driven by the fact that these risk ratings are so high and that the cost of debt is so high. And therefore, if you look at the debt service that the African continent will pay this year, it's about 88 billion. About 44 of that is to private creditors. And some of that is at very high rates, 11, 12, 13%. So if we could look at this kind of perception issue, dig into the data and figure out actually 1-2% of that perception, that kind of cost that governments are paying is due to perception, let's bring that down. Then you're unlocking tens of billions every year and to invest in schools and hospitals and those kinds of essentials it's not costing anyone any money. And it's simply a kind of a rebalancing of a system that is not up to date with the current reality of economies.
Thanks for breaking it down. So I just want to look at the recently concluded FFD where commitments were built on 4 pillars: scaling investment, addressing unsustainable debt, and reforming international financial governance. Now, all of these that we hear in all these global conversations are echoing the long-standing priorities of African governments and obviously institutions like One, Africatalist, and development, institutions like UNDP and the others. But to what extent do you think we can actually see some tangible reforms coming from events like this?
I think putting the issue on the agenda is the first step. But the next step after that, I think, is really getting to a blueprint or a roadmap that kind of starts to address the fundamental issues. And I think my fear about this debate is that it is quite divisive. You've got some in the debate basically saying credit rating agencies are biased, they need to change their methodology, and that's the core of the problem. Others in the debate are saying actually there's fundamental issues that African governments need to take on in terms of their, the governance, the transparency, the way in which debt is disclosed, and that poses fundamental risks that are real to investors, and therefore the risk ratings are fair. And I think the truth is somewhere in between.
Yeah.
And what we need to do is get, at a country level, get down to the detail of doing an analytical framework, figuring out okay, what are the data needs? What are the data sets that need to be disclosed? At what intervals and frequencies? What formats? And how do we set up systems to get that in place? Where are there a lack of understanding among the credit rating agencies? How can we promote better dialogue, increase the capacity of finance ministries to engage with credit rating agencies, push the credit rating agencies to invest more capacity in their in-country presence? And then there's the kind of bigger picture pieces around where do African countries need to come together to advocate for reforms on the international stage? And I think there's a lot there when it comes to the regulations that came in after the financial crisis, particularly the Basel III regulations that basically appropriate what was called a capital charge on investors that are investing in countries in the global south, because these were kind of regulations and standards that were designed to protect the banking system.
Yeah.
After the 2008 financial crisis, whenever you had all these kind of complex, risky banking instruments. And a lot of the experts on this issue kind of say, actually, the purpose of that, regulation is good, but the hindrance of investors in investing in emerging markets is a byproduct of this regulation, which is not good and needs to be reformed. And if it was reformed, it wouldn't affect the broader safety of the financial system, but it would allow investors much more space to invest at lower costs.
Yeah.
So I think we need to get down to that level of granularity. And one thing that I've been encouraged by is just, the South African G20 this year, this Africa expert panel that was established, led by Trevor Manuel, is really digging into the detail of these issues.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that coming out of that, we'll have like a very kind of detailed framework. And then governments and other international institutions will come in and be able to say, okay, well, we've got this blueprint or framework. Here's the actual work that we need to do on each of these elements of financial regulation and data transparency capacity, and put together a roadmap with milestones. In 6 months' time, we're going to have delivered this piece of work. In a year's time, we're going to be here. Like until we get to that level of granularity and have people actually doing that work, we're not going to move this forward.
David, you make a very valid point. I think, when we have milestones or action-oriented kind of plans, it could give us much more leverage. And, hearing you speak is more reiterates what a few of the experts we've had on the show also have mentioned, that, we can be saying the credit ratings agencies are unfair, are biased. Absolutely. We need to look within also our countries to really see how to make some systematic reforms, like you've mentioned, evidence-based advocacy or data. And I guess also that's where we've seen, for example, the Africa Credit Rating Agency being introduced. If you don't mind me asking, do you see that playing a role in any way of driving these reforms that we're talking about?
Well, I think they're similar to everything in this debate. There are different schools of thought. One is that this will kind of create a competitive dynamic, and that if an African credit rating agency is offering different ratings than the big three, then it will kind of create a pressure for the big three to reform. The other side of the debate is an African credit rating agency set up with the clear intention of offering African governments fairer ratings or kind of more favorable ratings will never be considered by international investors as serious. And I think, again, the truth is somewhere in the middle, that actually if you have this agency that is investing in the data frameworks, the analysis, the specifics, in a way that maybe the kind of big three credit rating agencies don't have the incentive to do, that actually there will be analysis that filters through and shapes their decision making, rather than the kind of core ratings themselves. I think the other element of this is African investors, African capital, African pension funds, like how do they consider risk, and are there ways in which those costs can be brought down? In that case, I think the African credit rating agencies could help play a really helpful role.
We just published a report that actually calls for a brief for the T20, which advocates for credit rating reforms. But if I were to ask you to look within, for example, some of the conversations we've spearheaded, and just taking into context that we need to be more strategic and just not be everywhere in terms of really pushing for credit rating reforms, which three critical reforms would you say really these need to happen for this conversation to even advance?
I'm a big fan of thinking on different time horizons, and I think there are specific practical things that could be done on the data in the next 6 months. So what I would do is I would say, let's identify the countries that really want to take this forward and work with them on identifying the data needs, producing that data, getting it disclosed, and getting into the hands of the credit rating agencies. On the medium term, I think there's a lot that needs to be done on the fundamental aspects of the risks that investors face. Are there, how do we kind of at a country level figure out, the prioritization of the key drivers of risk, break those down and address them step by step. And then on the kind of slightly longer term is this kind of big picture financial reform agenda, which I think will be very difficult to move forward in the next few years, partly just because of the geopolitics and the position of the US and so on. But we should be thinking about a 10-year plan for putting that on the agenda and reforming those kind of big picture regulations, which will require international consensus and a lot of work and kind of education, analysis, and so on. And part of that, I think, can be the big picture perception work. The work that Africa No Filter and Africa Practice did on looking at the way in which media reporting internationally of African countries drives risk I think is really interesting. And as the media landscape changes and those traditional media houses become less influential, I think there's a role for us to educate the influencers in a more fragmented media landscape to say, actually, Africa's diverse. There are different dynamics happening here. We need to think in a much more nuanced way about the perceptions of risk that investors face, and educate them on, what those nuances are and how they can really kind of think in a nuanced way about risk. And that's a kind of 5 to 10 year plan.
I mean, as we speak, I also bear in mind that there are countries that actually are not rated. And maybe this is something they say, oh, that's not my problem. But, it's some of these things that you learn as you go along the way. And I think, for example, when it comes to data, this is where organizations like One come in on the role of data and using evidence-based advocacy to drive these systematic changes. As we wind up on the program, David, I just wanted for you to give us an idea, looking at your AC, and I'm just looking at financial reforms broadly, or why Europe needs Africa. Can you connect that to the financial reform conversation, and why should global powers really care about making the system fairer for African countries?
So the essay series that I published last year, Why Europe Needs Africa, it was really kind of trying to shift this perception on its head. And when I started the work on the book, it was I was living in Brussels, and the primary perception there, I think, is that Africa is an aid program, and it's in need of help. Europe has money, Europe helps. And I think part of what I wanted to do is to say, actually, if you think about the future of Europe with an aging population, with the need to respond to climate change, with competitiveness challenges and, what they call cohesion challenges, different regions of the EU being left behind. Actually, for all of the things that Europe wants to achieve, it actually needs Africa. With Europe's aging, Africa has a youthful population. With Europe's climate transition, Africa has so much of the world's wind potential, solar potential, critical minerals. With the need for economic dynamism and productivity, so much of the creative energy is coming from African countries when it comes to tech, when it comes to climate solutions and so on. And I think when it comes to financial regulation, there is a kind of a sweet spot here, which is that Africa needs investment and Europe has surplus capital in terms of savings, but you need to kind of shift the incentives and the rules to make that capital flow. And in doing so, that capital could generate returns both for people in African countries and in European countries. And I think the other thing is that if you look at the representation of European countries in the international financial institutions, the IMF and World Bank and so on, it's the European countries that are overrepresented for the size of their economies and their populations.
Yeah.
And the African countries that are dramatically underrepresented. And at least the argument that I was making was that, in a time of like great power competition, it's almost like the last time that, or the kind of the most inopportune moment for making the case that countries should give up power. But actually, if they don't give up power, then these institutions become less and less relevant, and they will lose power anyway. So, in a sense, by sharing, more of the influence that you have in these institutions and reforming regulations in a way that benefit everyone, you're actually serving your own interests. And I think we need to make more of that kind of argument, because what has driven at least the kind of political incentives that have driven so much of the aid cuts in the past year have been this perception that aid is about charity, and that this is about rich countries giving to poor countries, and now that they aren't as rich, they can't afford it anymore.
Yeah.
We need a different kind of argument, which is we need to invest together in things that will make all of us stronger. And that's where this kind of work comes in, I think.
Mutual partnerships. And that's what creates the perception that Africa is risky, because it's need of aid, need of help. It doesn't really, the risk is higher. So it's one of the key challenges that we have as a continent. David, thanks for joining us on the show, but I'm not going to let you go before you just give us one last message. Now, for those that are listening in today, could be national institutions, statistics of governments, or government officials from finance, or even those trying to really understand the development context of sovereign credit ratings, or those countries that are not yet rated, or those that would love to be rated, or those that are going through a downgrade. What message would you leave with them in terms of strengthening their rating profile? I probably don't know where to start, but also linking it to the fact that it's not just about a rating, but it's also influencing every aspect of your economy.
Well, I think we're at a moment of like an inflection point when it comes to tariffs, ODA cuts, declines in foreign direct investment, and even the kind of shifts in the financing model of China. And this is a kind of like survival moment. And in order to survive, we need to address these kinds of issues that aren't impossible to address. It's not like we're trying to create money out of nowhere. This is about tweaks to the regulatory system, tweaks to the perception of our economies that are driving needless costs in how we're financing our governments. And therefore getting specific, seeing this as a top priority. In a sense, if we get this right, it's unlocking free money. And if we can do that in a way which is granular, that gets to specifics of, who needs to be doing what by when, then we can make a lot of progress. So I would see this as, a very practical response to a world where so much of the future is outside of our control. But this is something where we can really get specific, really do some work and reduce those costs and unlock financing for development and for climate action, which is what we all need.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David, for having time to join us on the show. Personally, I've taken 2 points away from here, and I hope everyone has been able to pick something. The need for data and the perception is really critical and key. Thank you so much, David, for joining us on the show.
Thank you, Maggie.
Yeah. And to our listeners, you can find this episode and others of the development context of sovereign credit ratings on Spotify and YouTube. This podcast is part of the Africa Credit Ratings Initiative, a partnership between UNDP and Africa at Least. and focused on helping African countries strengthen their engagement with credit rating agencies. I'm Maggie Mutesi, and thank